look at the owners, and it doesn't reflect the diversity of the country.
Welcome to the Washington Tech Policy Podcast.
The latest tech law and policy news and brightest tech law and policy experts wherever you are.
So you can stay informed, on the move, in less time.
From Washington, D.C., it's the Washington Tech Policy Podcast.
With Joe Miller.
Joe Miller.
Pelosi blasts Facebook for the tech giant's insistence on intentionally allowing politicians' ads to remain on the platform, even if they contain misstatements. How will this end, and should broadcasters meet the same standard? And Yosef Kitachu is my guest. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi ripped Facebook last week, saying the company shamefully, intentionally misleads voters by failing to remove political ads. Ms. Pelosi specifically called out Facebook's capitalistic model as being antithetical to democracy and a fair election in 2020. She told reporters Thursday that Facebook only wants two things: continued tax cuts and weak antitrust enforcement. Congressman Butterfield, as well as Congresswomen Yvette Clarke and Val Demings, all Democrats, introduced three separate bills last week to improve media ownership diversity, which remains in single-digit percentages. Meanwhile, over the past several decades, all three branches of government under Republican leadership in the White House and with congressional and Supreme Court Republican majorities have set the groundwork to allow right-wing station owners to suck up stations across the country and spread the same hate and propaganda that got Trump elected. The bills introduced last week are designed to require the FCC to collect more media ownership data, EEO data, and reintroduce tax incentives for station owners that sell their stations to women and people of color. More on that in my interview with Yosef Kitachu in a moment. Robocall-blocking service YouMail released a report last week finding a 22% increase in the number of robocalls placed in the U.S. since 2018. The company claims that Americans received nearly 18 robocalls per year in 2019. According to the company, overall, Americans have received some 100 billion robocalls over the last 2 years. At the end of December, President Trump signed bipartisan legislation to reduce robocalls. John Carlin, the former chief of staff to Robert Mueller, reportedly told The Hill that the federal government still isn't doing enough to prevent election interference. Mr. Carlin says the federal government's response to the 2016 cyber attacks, including a $425 million spending bill to address election security, haven't gone far enough in the government's ongoing effort to deal with the proliferation of ransomware and what he termed a here and present threat. According to the National Institute of Justice's own website, it awarded nearly $2 million to Purdue University to assign convicted offenders wearable devices and then monitor them remotely to determine the likelihood that they'll commit future crimes. The NIJ claims the goal is to determine whether offenders should be permitted to re-enter society. But the results of the study could have significant implications for mass surveillance, as the study, which calls for testing 250 randomly selected offender participants, will likely unfairly target African American inmates, since roughly 40% of the prison population is African American, even though we comprise 13% of the total U.S. population. The Washington City paper reports that the number of ghost guns police discovered in 2019 grew by 25% compared to the year before, or to more than 115 ghost guns. The D.C. police found only 3 such guns in 2017. Ghost guns are guns made from materials that can't be found by metal detectors, such as the plastic used to print 3D guns. The D.C. Council has proposed a bill that would ban some, but not all, of the 3D printed guns, but some officials are worried that legislation doesn't encompass enough of the various types of ghost guns. DC officials report that ghost guns were used in 3 homicides in 2019. You can find links to all of these stories in the show notes. Stay with us.
You're plugged into the Washington Tech Policy Podcast, the inclusive voice of tech policy.
My guest today is Yosef Kitachu. He serves as Program Director of the Media and Democracy Program at Common Cause. Prior to joining Common Cause, Yosef served as a Public Policy Fellow at Public Knowledge, where he worked on a variety of technology and communications issues. His work is focused on broadband privacy, broadband access and affordability, and other consumer issues. Please welcome Yosef Kitachu. Yosef, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So last time you were on the show, it was before we even hit 100 episodes back in 2017, which is hard to believe.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible one, just how far the Washington Policy Podcast has come in the last 2 years. I think you've done about 200 shows.
This is going to be 216. Is it 216? Let me see. I'm going to make sure I have that right. Yep. Yeah. I have the gray hairs to show for it. So
Yeah.
A group of members in the House last week, including Congressman Butterfield and Congresswoman Demings, Clark, and other members, introduced a package of bills to address the lack of diversity in media ownership. So we're going to address those, but first tell us a bit about Common Cause and your work there.
Common Cause is a nonprofit grassroots organization where we're focused on democracy reform issues. We work on a lot of core democracy policies like voting rights, redistricting, money in politics, the census, and my area is on media and democracy. So when it comes to media and democracy, we really try and work at the intersection of technology and democracy issues. When you think about how much technology has impacted our democracy, from the way we receive our news and information, or the ability we have to vote or participate in elections or be civically engaged, it really depends on, one, if you have access to these technologies, two, who's owning these technologies, and three, how these technologies are presented to you when it comes to consumer protection issues or affordability issues or any type of other access issues. So we have four big areas in our media and democracy program. The first one is defending and restoring net neutrality. The second is promoting independent and diverse owners in our media landscape. The third is ensuring everyone has access to broadband. And finally, making sure that our press is free and independent.
So give us some background on media ownership. What's the status of media ownership diversity today?
Media ownership diversity today is pretty dismal. If you look at the data that the FCC has collected on who owns the media, it's primarily white people. Diverse owners are very little when it comes to traditional television stations and radio stations. If you look at the FCC's data for full power television stations, women own 7.4%. The Latinx community owns about 4.5%, and African Americans own 0.9% of full power television stations. I believe American Indians and Native Hawaiians own less than 1% combined. It's pretty incredible when you look at the diversity of our country and look at how many communities rely on media for consumption and for news and information. And you look at the owners, and it doesn't reflect the diversity of the country.
You know, I've been reading Ann Nelson's book called The Shadow Network, and she's actually going to be on the show in the next few weeks. And she talks about how over 20 or 30 years, right-wing Christian organizations and right-wing conservative Republicans just sort of took over AM radio. And now, just to use as an example, Salem Media owns like 2,400 stations around the country, and they've used these stations to spread hate, spread propaganda. And it's just interesting to see that sort of in parallel with that. We've seen, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. We've seen the repeal of the tax certificate. And, to some extent, it's almost like it's by design.
Right. I mean, this is really what the core of media and democracy is about. If you don't have diverse voices in our media ecosystem, then you allow one or two big companies or entities to control what people see and hear through the media. And it could be politically slanted at times, or it could be one entity with a clear agenda trying to jam that through the media. So you have the Salem medias of the world, you have the Sinclair medias of the world, the Clear channels that own hundreds of stations and are able to control what those stations broadcast to so many different communities. And that just drowns out diverse voices, and it has a direct correlation to whether or not people vote in elections. Oftentimes, the media has the ability to suppress the vote or get out the vote for certain constituencies. It has the ability to influence how people are civically engaged, whether they're petitioning their government for services, whether they know about these services. A lot of times it's based on who owns the media. And so if you just have one or two entities owning the media, you could have a situation where a certain president gets elected, or a certain official can jam through his agenda and no one else has a say.
So let's get some historical perspective here. The federal government began regulating electronic media in 1927 with the Federal Radio Commission, which later became the FCC. Tell us a bit about how the regulation of media ownership has evolved.
The FCC was created in Congress through the Communications Act of 1934. And Congress gave the FCC the ability to oversee the broadcast industry. We're talking about radio and eventually broadcast television, along with a few other entities. And so what the FCC has done is issue licenses to entities to use the public airwaves to broadcast programming to different communities. And when it issues licenses, it has to find that companies are upholding the public interest. So, if you're applying for a license to say you want to broadcast in this community, you have to explain why this is going to be in the public interest. In relation to this, the FCC has three principles of upholding its public interest values to media ownership. The FCC is required to promote localism, competition, and diversity. So localism is essentially the idea that if a broadcast entity is providing programming to community, that programming needs to be local, or it needs to at least adhere to the interests and needs of that community. Competition is this idea that there should be multiple owners in a single market. It shouldn't just be one entity owning all the television stations or all of the radio stations. And diversity is really split up into two areas: viewpoint diversity and ownership diversity. So with viewpoint diversity, is that the content should be different. You should be getting a diverse array of programming in your marketplace. And then ownership diversity is the idea that, we want women and people of color to be able to own the media. It shouldn't just be one entity, one big conglomerate that's controlled by white men. It should be a diverse array of owners to give you multiple perspectives and diverse programming in your community. So in upholding these principles, the FCC has adopted a number of policies over the years when it comes to media ownership. These policies range from actually outlining what these public interest responsibilities look like to actually placing limits on how many stations one entity can own in a market. But what we've seen is that over the years, many of these rules and policies have pretty much been eliminated. It's policies from requiring stations to have a studio in the licensed area that they serve, policies that limit how many stations one entity can own in a market, policies that try and raise the cap of stations people can own. All of those have been eliminated, or the FCC has tried to eliminate those. And so in each instance, when the FCC has relaxed or eliminated its media ownership rules, we've seen a wave of consolidation take place. So even just the past few years, we saw Sinclair try to acquire Tribune. Nexstar eventually acquired Tribune. We've seen Apollo, a private equity firm, take control of Cox and Northwest Broadcasting. We've seen Ray and Graycom merge, and the list just goes on and on. And so the question is, what do these media ownership policies have to do with diversity and media ownership diversity? And it's really critical to understand that the licensing system that I mentioned earlier was not structured in a way that was equitable to everyone. The FCC granted its first broadcast license to a woman in 1922, but it didn't grant any licenses to applicants of color until 1949. And it didn't grant any television licenses to people of color until 1973. So that just goes to show you that there's been years of systemic exclusion and discrimination in the licensing system that has kept people of color from owning the media. So then when you have policies that deregulate consolidation and allow one entity to own so much of the media, it just drowns out diverse voices, and it makes it harder for even the few owners of color that we have today to maintain ownership. If you're a owner of color and you own a television station in one market, that is dominated by a Sinclair or a big media conglomerate, it's going to be tough to compete with that player. It's going to be tough to get the same type of advertising revenue or get competitive with the same programming, or to really serve the community in a way that is profitable to you and beneficial to the community. And so that's why ownership policies and the FCC's media ownership oversight is critical to promoting more diverse owners of color in the marketplace.
Yeah, there was a brief period after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated when the FCC passed some policies after the Johnson administration released its Kerner Commission report, which reported on that summer of 68 with all of the riots that were happening around that time. And that was a very, very brief period of policies that were actually helpful to increasing media ownership diversity. And then along came the Reagan administration, which eliminated the fairness doctrine, and then from there we had things like the '96 Act, which deregulated the industry. So it's just been a whole host of things that have worked in parallel, with this power grab by conservative voices, and this has been kind of enabled by all three branches of government. You had a Republican Supreme Court that decided the Adirondack case, which raised the standard for affirmative action cases. It was a Reagan administration with the fairness doctrine, and today we have Ajit Pai. Fortunately, it failed in court, but Ajit Pai recently tried to relax the newspaper cross-ownership rule, which allows station owners to own a newspaper in the same market. So fortunately, that rule is still in place. But there's really been this effort to buy up all of these stations. And, we can talk about the merits, but at some point we have to talk about, when we're talking about policy, we have to talk about the politics that are behind a lot of these decisions.
Right. It's been a huge political issue for so long, because I think there's an understanding that there is a lack of diversity, but there's also understanding that, certain organizations or entities may not want more diversity to maintain their own control and their own power. When you mentioned the FCC attempting to deregulate more of the ownership rules, you've had a Third Circuit Court tell them for 4 times now, hey, you can't just do this without examining how this impacts ownership diversity. Where is the studies? Where is the data that shows that your policies to just allow more consolidation actually help for women and people of color? And this is something that they're statutorily required to do, but they just haven't done it yet. And you have to ask why.
Yeah, and then you have Byron Allen bringing a lawsuit against Comcast because he was claiming that he was discriminated against in the carriage of his channels. And now Comcast wants the Supreme Court essentially to overturn the 1866 Civil Rights Act, or the portion of the Civil Rights Act that would apply. There are a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah, when you talk about cable, that's a whole other area that has also faced a lot of systemic exclusion and discrimination over the years. I think Byron Allen's case highlights a lot of that, where he's just showing that one conglomerate in Comcast does not want to carry his channels, his networks, even though other networks do. And when you look at diverse programming on cable, that's also dismal in a lot of ways. When you look at how leasing space or accessing programming on cable works, a lot of times it's the big networks that have that ability. And it's not the independent programmers, it's not the diverse programmers that get those opportunities. And that's unfortunate.
Well, it'll be interesting to see the Supreme Court's decision there. Well, we're going to take a break here, Yosef, and when we come back, we'll talk about the bills introduced last week. Stay with us. So tell us about the bills that were introduced last week in the House.
Sure. So last week, the House held a media diversity hearing that served as an opportunity to start getting into some discussions on how we address media diversity ownership. And we had a number of members actually introduce bills to tackle some of the challenges. So the first one is from Congresswoman Clark. She introduced the Enhancing Broadcaster Diversity Data Act. So this bill really does 2 things. One, it requires the FCC to begin collecting industry-wide broadcast television employment data under its equal employment opportunity rules. This is something that the FCC has failed to do since 2001. So over 15 years, they haven't collected this data. And what we've seen is that employment data is critical to actually seeing who's in these broadcast stations as employees. Oftentimes, it's working in these broadcast stations that serves as a pipeline to actually owning your station. Learning how a station's managed, learning the ins and outs of the business is a great way to get your foot in the door. But the FCC hasn't actually collected that data in so long, and so we don't know what that marketplace looks like, even though we have some ideas that it's probably not as diverse as it could be. So that's one aspect of that bill. The second one is requiring the FCC to regularly collect broadcast ownership data. This is something that the FCC already does through its Form 323 data collection process, but this is something that they just haven't done adequately enough over the years. So under this data collection process, broadcast owners are required to fill out a form to identify their ownership structure. But a lot of times what we've seen is that in past years, that broadcast owners haven't fully filled out the form. We haven't seen all broadcasters fill out the form, so that skews the data. Or that the FCC has used different tools that make the data anonymous for some broadcasters. Again, this is something that skews the data and doesn't give us a complete picture of ownership diversity. So back in our conversation earlier, I mentioned the numbers that the FCC has for broadcast ownership diversity for women and people of color. And those numbers are already bad, but it's highly likely that if they collect the data fully and more adequately, the numbers will be a lot lower. And we need these numbers to actually get the best picture of the marketplace today. So that's one bill. The second bill was introduced by Congressman Butterfield. This is the Expanding Broadcast Ownership Opportunities Act. Basically, this bill would revitalize the tax certificate program. This was a program that was implemented back in the 70s, but was unfortunately rolled back in 95. What it does is basically incentivizes the media companies of today to sell stations to women and people of color. The incentive is really a tax credit or a tax break, however you want to categorize it. So if they sell to a diverse person, they're able to take that capital gains and get some sort of tax credit out of it. What we saw when this tax certificate program was in place, there was an influx of more diverse owners in the marketplace. Unfortunately, when it rolled back, many of those diverse owners couldn't maintain their stations anymore. Then finally, Congressman Long introduced the Media Diversity Act. It essentially asked the FCC to consider what are the market entry barriers for socially disadvantaged individuals in the communications marketplace. The last bill is a House resolution, which essentially says that the House is committed to media diversity and figuring out how to develop policies to actually improve the current status of media diversity ownership.
So lots of great work there. Lots to think about here, and it'll be interesting once the FCC collects the data, if those bills pass, what we're actually working with when it comes to diverse ownership. Well, thanks again, Yosef, for shedding light for us here. What are some final thoughts you'd like to leave with us before we close, and where can we find you online?
Sure. So final thoughts are that media diversity ownership is critical for sustaining and enhancing our current democracy. If we don't have diverse owners in the marketplace, if just one or two entities control much of the media, then it makes it harder for all of us to actually fully participate in our democracy today. So you can find me online at Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Getachew2. You can also find me on our Common Cause website, commoncause.org.
You've been listening to Yosef Kitachu, Media and Democracy Director at Common Cause. Yosef, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Joe.
That concludes episode 216 of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. If you like what we do, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment, head over to Apple Podcasts, give it a rating and review. It helps others know what they can expect from the show and really helps us out. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you back here next week. Take care.
Washington.